Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Biopharma Dive webinar, Partnering for Success, doing study startup right in the context of decentralized studies. We're excited you could join us. My name is Laura Beth Ezel, and I'll be moderating today's event. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. Please note the slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. To enlarge the slides, click the Enlarge Slides button located in the top right-hand corner of your presentation window. Now, we encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A widget. We will try to answer these during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. So please know we do capture all your questions, and you are welcome to submit those as you think of them. Finally, following the presentation, you will be able to access the on-demand recording of the webinar using the same link from today's live event. Well, we are thrilled to be joined today by Marina Acosta-Insland, Director of Clinical Management at Roe. Marina is a diversely skilled clinical research professional with over 20 years of experience across phase 1 through 4 studies. Prior to joining Roe, she has held positions in the areas of clinical monitoring, site-level study coordination, site startup, and clinical study management. Marina has extensive experience working on regional and global HIV, oncology, acute pain, and vaccine clinical trials. Nearly half of her career has been focused on HIV/AIDS research, working on NIH and industry-funded clinical trials. Marina has a strong understanding of clinical trial management and delivery requirements, which has allowed her to successfully lead teams to meet deliverables. We are also excited to be joined by Mark Wilson, Study Startup Services Manager at Roe. Mark Wilson has 14 years of clinical research experience working on phase 1 through 3 studies. Mark spent several years across multiple roles in study startup before moving into clinical operations and working as a CRA for 6 years, monitoring infectious disease, pediatric, women's health, oncology, and hematology trials. He then moved into the clinical operations lead role, providing line management and operational leadership on novel compounds in global oncology and hematology trials. Across his career, Mark has managed startup and clinical operations within both FSP and full-service frameworks. After a decade in clinical operations, Mark returned to startup, overseeing staff and processes for projects from the feasibility stage to site activation. Today, we are going to deep dive on the importance of study startup in decentralized trials. Study startup sets the foundation for success of your clinical trial. There are many considerations for vendor selection and partnerships during development and startup. With these come challenges, complex protocols, gaps in site expectations, problems with enrollment and retention, etc. To combat these challenges and improve the chance for success, there are several important concepts to keep in mind in the context of decentralized trials. Now, in this webinar, we will discuss the importance of study startup in decentralized trials to establish patient centricity, ease of enrollment, risk mitigation, and preserving data integrity. Well, it is a pleasure to have you on today's webinar. I'd now like to hand it over to Marina and Mark.
Thank you, Laura Beth. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. As Laura Beth noted, Mark and I are here today to discuss startup in the context of decentralized clinical trials. As we moved into that space a couple years ago, we recognized immediately the impact that DCT can have on startup activities and timelines, and we had to pivot quickly. So after Mark provides you with a short refresher on DCT, we will discuss some considerations for driving startup in the context of DCT. Mark?
Thank you, Marina. Hey, everyone. I hope you're having a really good Thursday. So as Marina mentioned, I will go ahead and give you, short little background of DCTs. So what I wanted to do is just review the background and utility of decentralized clinical trials. The adoption of full DCTs has grown very slowly in the decade since the first patient enrolled in a fully decentralized trial. However, a trial does not have to be fully decentralized in order to gain many of the efficiencies and benefits DCTs provide. These hybrid trials may harness the benefits of DCTs, such as cost savings, while keeping traditional elements of other trials. So during the pandemic, the use of hybrid trials and full DCTs actually exploded, as many of us are probably all aware. As social distancing and pressures on our health systems grew, as Marina mentioned, we all did have to pivot. So as sponsors and providers have come to understand these methods, the expectation is that the use of these will continue to grow. All right, so a full DCT would be delivered to the patient with zero inpatient contact. However, a hybrid approach is often used, and most likely you or your organization is currently working on a hybrid trial. Many trials that are open today use at least one decentralized method, utilizing a mix and match of virtual tools such as ePro, telemedicine, wearable devices, home health, or direct delivery of IP and trial supplies to patient homes. Right. And as noted at the start, the pandemic has required the limiting of face-to-face interaction, and many trials took on a decentralized characteristic to cope with the challenges of continuing our operations during COVID. Working in the sciences, I believe our industry has long embraced proven technologies and innovations in order to develop remote and efficient solutions. These innovations culminated in the launch of a fully decentralized trial in 2011, and although the uptake of these full trials may have been slow, the use of many of the methods, technologies, and tools have exploded during the pandemic. As more professionals see the success of these elements, many will become permanent fixtures in our landscape. And we also have plenty of organizations and entities that have popped up to support the adaptation of DCTs. So these include the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which was created way back in 2007 by the Food and Drug Administration, as well as one of Roe's hometown universities, Duke. And more recently, the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance has also popped up. These organizations provide collaboration and guidance to industry in navigating DCTs. CTTI has actually provided some recommendations for supporting decentralized trial approaches by advising early planning and involvement of all stakeholders, as well as attention to quality and transparent communication. So we'll try to hit on some of this advice as we discuss the considerations when starting up a hybrid or DCT. So at this point, I'm actually going to hand it back over to Marina, who will discuss patient centricity in DCTs.
Thanks again, Mark. So you're going to hear a very common theme today, and that is starting early, designing early, thoughtful planning, proactivity. All of those concepts are really important when it comes to designing a successful program or a successful study. And that is certainly true when you're talking about designing a study that involves DCT, whether you're doing a hybrid approach or full DCT, or maybe just using one or two technologies or aspects of decentralized trials. That early proactive planning and building that into the design of your program and into your protocol is going to be key to success. So the first topic I wanted to talk about is patient centricity. That's one of the main components or goals of DCT, is to make patient the center of the study and to take the patient population into consideration. And as I mentioned, and again, it's going to be a common theme, thoughtful protocol design is key to successful implementation, and thinking about that patient comes first in that thoughtful design. Each patient population is different. So you have to take into consideration what the patient population for your study or your program is going to look like. What are the demographics? Is it an older population that may be uncomfortable or unfamiliar with technology? Is it a younger population that is in the field and they're working and they have busy lives and they don't have time to come into site visits once a week for 12 weeks? Where is the geography of these patients? We do a lot of work in rare disease, so sometimes those patients are not all centralized in one location. Not only do we have to find sites where the patients are, but sometimes patients have to travel very long distances to come in for visits. So DCT helps ease that burden by giving those patients who live far away from some of your sites an opportunity to participate in those studies without having to come in frequently into a clinic. And then another consideration when you're looking at your patient population is, what is the health of that population like? Are they able to use an ePro device, or are they able to manage complex patient questionnaires that they may be given. Are they capable to move into, come into a different city for a site visit, for example? So you want to keep all of those things into account as you're designing what your decentralized trial or what components that you're going to use in your decentralized trial to make sure that it's feasible for the population that you're looking at, and not only feasible for them, but will make life a little bit easier for them. So as you're determining that, there are different types of technologies available, as Mark alluded to. There's ePro versus eCOA. ePro is usually a device in the hand of a patient. eCOA makes it easier for sites to do direct data entry into a source as opposed to having to do transcription into an EDC. There are wearable devices that patients can wear. So are you using a pediatric population where maybe a wearable is not the most ideal solution because it can be broken or get lost? There are sensory-based devices. Are you running a trial in an area where IP compliance is very important to monitor? There are devices available to help monitor that IP compliance. And then as you're discussing populations where mobility is perhaps an issue, or it's a study where a caregiver is bringing a patient into clinic and it's more challenging for them to come to frequent visits, then there are considerations for home health and telemedicine. So again, you want to think of all of these different components as you're building your protocol, as you're setting up your design, developing your schedule of events, what makes sense for this study, what is key, what is going to help the patient, because all of that is going to drive more successful recruitment into that study. If a patient really wants to participate in your study and you make it easy for them, you're going to find that your study is easier to recruit. Some other additional considerations: once you've recruited the patients, what is their experience like? How can you retain those patients? And then with the use of new technology or the use of a decentralized clinical trial where it's not a traditional trial that some people may be used to, what tools are you going to develop to help with patient education and to help them learn how to use perhaps complex devices or understand the study? And of course, anything that goes into a patient's hand is going to need to be approved by an ethics committee or an IRB. So how does this relate to startup? As I mentioned before, planning out your protocol, having a solid version of your protocol before you start your study builds, particularly if you're using multiple technologies. Usually there's quite a study build time beforehand, 8 weeks to 12 weeks to sometimes even 16 weeks, depending on what technology it is that you're using. So if you have a solid version of that protocol that is not going to require changes to those study builds, you're going to ensure those build timelines and ensure that you can activate sites according to your timeline. If you're working with a version of the protocol that maybe isn't quite as solid and maybe you haven't thought as much about some of those components and you have to make changes, then that of course is going to push out your ability to activate your sites and to complete those study builds. One thing that is very important, I think, is thinking about what vendors you want to select early on and partnering with those vendors. And if you're going to be outsourcing, partnering with those CROs or those vendors early on is important as well. They are experts in the area of DCT, if that's the technology that you're using, and they're going to be able to help inform on your protocol. They're going to help find challenges and help mitigate risks that you're going to see along the way. So the earlier on those partnerships are formed, the easier startup is going to be. You may notice that I've been talking about a lot of other things before I've discussed feasibility and site selection. And that's because I think it's really key to have those things nailed down before you start going out to sites and selecting your sites. When you get to that site selection piece, you want startup to move really quickly. And if you're still trying to figure out builds and select a vendor, that's going to push your activation timelines out. And really, you can lose some of that enthusiasm from your sites. So once you have those other things in place, then you can start thinking about what sites you want to use. You want to go to sites that have experience in the area, that have comfort and familiarity with the technology. You also want to think about what recruitment materials and what patient tools you want to have available for your patients, and have those materials available in plenty of time to be able to submit them to ethics committees or regulatory authorities, depending on where you are in the world. You also want to keep regulatory considerations in mind. Some of our rules here in the US are a little bit different than they are in Europe, and you want to keep those in consideration when you're running a global trial. And then most importantly, it's really important to develop an activation plan with vendor requirements and timelines and considerations so that you can align all of those timelines and have one single timeline and hopefully be able to adhere to that timeline. And now I'm going to pass it back over to Mark to discuss enrollment.
And I just realized I'm on mute. Sorry, I was on mute, so I did not interrupt your presentation. My apologies. Anyway, thank you, Marina. I'll now go ahead and start reviewing enrollment. As with any trial, quickly meeting enrollment expectations is a high priority. And excess in enrollment begins in the startup within the design, as Marina mentioned, as well as initiation and then execution of the trial. So the first step in meeting our enrollment goals is rapid site activation. So early consideration of potential activation delays is essential, and care should be taken in understanding some of the newer challenges presented by DCTs. As discussed, and I think will be a theme, DCTs will often use a lot more vendors, and these vendors are there to remotely deliver quick and quality results. And we'll discuss the selection of these vendors a little bit later when we're discussing some risk. However, in order to ensure rapid activation, we should ensure that the vendor systems and the requirements from the site is fully understood at the KOM or even much earlier. So once a site is selected, we want to be able to provide a clear and concise instructions from each vendor to the site with that site notification letter. That way the site knows what actions need to be taken and what information should be provided right there from the start. So a week before the SIV, I think we all know is no time to find out that a vendor requires some missing information from a site, and that vendor is going to take 15 days to process that information and get a shipment out. All right. Moving on to discuss a little bit about recruitment and retention. Again, pulling back to startup, it's very important to build recruitment plans during the startup period. And you want to make sure those plans take advantage of the many unique characteristics that DCTs provide. And DCTs are in a decentralized trial. A patient may never set foot in a site. And so whereas in traditional trials, site patient databases are very important as far as recruiting patients and are still going to be important in decentralized trial. A potential advantage of a decentralized trial is reaching patients that would not have been reached previously. So in order to do this, building relationships and utilizing patient advocacy groups, this can allow our trial to locate candidates that would have never found their way to a research site. And with a full DCT, they'll never have to. So once a candidate is identified, screening and enrollment can proceed quicker than it would if we had to get a patient that would have to find time in their schedule for several treks to a medical center, to get to a screening visit, to get to an enrollment visit, to get consented. So this same convenience may lead to higher retention and compliance as the patient burden is reduced throughout the trial. So, however, this convenience is the result of newer technologies, and we'll also want to consider patients that may be naive or resistant to technologies that we have selected for the trial. All options are not always going to be appropriate for every patient population, and ensuring that we understand the limitations of our population through discussions with providers and advocacy groups ahead of time in the trial design stage could be very key to which technologies benefit rapid enrollment in a trial and which may be a hindrance. So these tools, when used correctly, can expand the footprint of each site. Not only are we able to push into more rural areas where patients may have less access to clinical trial sites, we can also reach other underrepresented patients. These may be patients that have been left out of clinical trials due to age, mobility issues, or work requirements to where they cannot really meet on a trial site during a weekday. And as we expand that geographic footprint and that patient range of each site, we really should be able to reduce the number of sites needed to meet our goals. So with less sites, startup proceeds a lot more quicker and more efficient as we reduce the entire burden of the trial by reducing number of site contracts, IRBs, and data that needs to be collected from sites for each vendor. As discussed, there may be a lot more vendors, so having less sites to balance that out and collecting that data is going to be a benefit. Also less supply deliveries, and if drug is being delivered to the site, less drug deliveries as well. All right, now I would like to move on to risk mitigation. Managing risk is, of course, an important part of every clinical trial, and decentralized trials are absolutely no different in the need to proactively identify risk right there from the very start. So if we're used to working with and scoring risk in a traditional clinical trial, we may first want to start by identifying our key differences and methods used in a hybrid or DCT trial against a traditional trial. So we do have some organizations, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations are out there with tools and accessories to really help us out. So we have organizations such as the Association of Clinical Research Organizations. They have tools right there available on their websites to assist in exercises of identifying different risks and scoring them as far as related to decentralized trials. We want to identify and evaluate those new risk areas. Big area that we have, again, discussed additional systems, additional vendors, and how oversight may be managed by the sponsor, by the CRO, or by the PI. In some areas, we may feel like the risk has been reduced, such as the likelihood that a procedure is missed, that a dose is missed, or a visit is missed. Now that a patient's not actually having to travel to a site, also possibly has technology and applications on their phone that remind them of when to take a certain dose, or when to submit a certain amount of data. So in other areas, we would want to consider how the decentralization is really affecting the trial and may increase risks, such as a PI that's used to our traditional trials how are they going to provide oversight when we've got all these different new systems in use? And again, we want to identify that at the beginning, ensure that PIs are properly trained, and identify PIs that may have experience in doing this as well. So again, back to site selection. This is going to be key to minimizing risk in any trials. However, with DCTs, we may need to adjust our feasibility. We may want to add additional focus in this area since we are working in a newer and different model where the team's experience, they may have limitations. So here we want to ensure that our feasibility and selection plans are highly robust and have really thought through all the changes and all the differences from a traditional trial and how they are going to address these novel methods. So this may be new to some or many on the team. We really must guarantee that our CRAs that are conducting the site qualifications visits know the additional areas that must be examined. And so we must really provide that additional and adequate training, as well as checklists and tools that appropriately assess the DCT capabilities and experience of each site and each PI.
And if I could jump in there real quick, Mark, sure. I just want to add about the tools. While using standard tools and templates that you've used over and over and over again are great, they can be a great starting point. It's really important as you move into this new space that you really customize those per study and per protocol so that CRAs can really target in exactly what's needed from each site as they're being assessed.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Marina. And so as discussed previously, vendor selection is going to be equally important, and it needs to be thought back as early in the design phase as possible. So as we are aware, new technologies also bring new enterprises into this field. And these new enterprises may have excellent products, but they also may not have very long track records. So this should really raise some serious questions on the system reliability, on the system's interoperability. So these questions should not be trusted just with the vendor alone, and we should really be carefully vetting and validating each new method and ensure that we're using qualified individuals within our organizations or consultants if we need. And as we move forward with these new methods, careful and deliberate scrutiny prior to the trial's start will, of course, limit risk down the line. And now kind of on to one of the big risks, and, as it was spoken of before, a fully decentralized trial does need to get drug to the patient without them coming to the clinic. And so if we want to go fully decentralized, how are we going to handle drug distribution when the patient isn't coming in? So I'm sure many of us discovered during the pandemic that's something we may never have considered previously, that it could and would be done. And so that's direct shipment to the patient. So this is certainly a part of DCTs that brings a bit more complexity, as well as a bit more risk than the traditional model of drug being stored at various clinics, with being distributed to patients at those clinics, with a CRA coming to the clinic, once a month, conducting accountability, and, reporting everything back so that we're catching everything as we go. So this is certainly a risk that needs to be planned and assessed step by step before any trial activities begin. So we must ensure that any plan is fully allowed by local regulations, of course, and methods must be applied to ensure that chain of custody is maintained, as well as temperature monitoring. So we do, of course, have new technology that is helping us here, such as apps that are now available to verify the patient's receipt, as well as their storage and proper dosing of the drug. And new solutions are even appearing on the horizon that are currently being explored, such as the potential to distribute IP through retail drug outlets that are near a patient's home. Now, of course, some of these aspects still need to be a little bit fleshed out and explored before they are implemented. And then we've got another big risk is, patients' rights and privacies and how that's going to be handled in the decentralized model. So with DCTs and the higher use of non-centralized systems to communicate with the patient and between sites and vendors, there's going to be an increased risk to these areas. So on-the-ground considerations, such as ensuring a patient's understanding during remote consent, or ensuring a courier does not deliver supplies or IP to a neighbor or unauthorized individual, need to be considered and planned for when studying the decentralized trial. And then, of course, we do have all that data, and that data is going to be the basis of any clinical trial. But now, and over the years, we have moved from the data being locked in a PI's office and securely transferred, to flowing through an ever increasing number of EMRs, electronic systems, vendors, devices, and now even possibly across patients' own devices. So ensuring the most up-to-date and robust cybersecurity is in use by each system, by each vendor, is a must, and ensuring their interoperability with each other to ensure data security needs to be thoroughly vetted and validated. So we do have some emerging technology kind of coming up and starting to be explored and applied. And so that's going to be, the increased usage of blockchain. And you guys have probably all heard of it. It's sort of the basis of cryptocurrency, but used in many other uses in other industries. So the technology is being developed and deployed to allow the efficient exchange of data with considerably increased security. So blockchain has its own decentralized nature, and that's really helps it remove, risky and centralized databases through the data connecting through some of these blockchain channels. And now I'm going to actually hand it back over to Marina, who will finish up by discussing data integrity.
Great, thanks, Mark. One of the more complex components of DCT studies really can be the data. As Mark alluded to, you need to be concerned about the security of your data, as well as the data flow, particularly the more sources that you have, the more challenging that can be. So one thing that you want to consider, again, going back to early planning, quality by design, is taking into consideration how that data is going to flow. And the more data that you have, the more moving parts you have. So, key component here coming from E6R2 is a consideration of what data is being collected and what is critical. Is the data that you're capturing critical? Great. If not, do you really need it? And in some instances, the answer to that is yes, you do. and then a consideration of why. Really honing in on capturing the most critical data as possible, the data that you really need to drive the success of your study, to drive to your end goal is really important. Extra data that you maybe don't need can certainly cloud things or muddy the waters. So that careful design and careful consideration of what data, first of all, that you're going to be collecting and do you really need it, needs to be taken into consideration. And that will help ease the data flow so that the data that is flowing is the data that is critical to your study. And then the next consideration is how data is going to be collected. A lot of times when you are running a hybrid DCT, which is the most common form of DCT that you're going to see right now, you're going to have data being collected in multiple sources, whether they're in different devices and a combination of those devices and wearables and traditional data capture at sites or maybe in eCOA. At the end of the day, there may be some reconciliation needed, which brings me to another point in terms of what data is being collected and where it's being collected, eliminating the collection of data in multiple places. Because if you're collecting data in multiple places for the same data point, you will have to reconcile that. And if it can't reconcile well, then you're going to have some issues when you're trying to lock a database and close the study. So reduce the need for that type of reconciliation. But then again, you want to have a reconciliation between your multiple sources to make sure that the data that you're getting is telling a similar story and that it's all on the same page. And then, of course, the last consideration is how is that data going to be reviewed? If it's traditional on-site, then you can send a monitor out there and have that CRA monitor that data while you're on site. However, if you're collecting data direct from patient more frequently, if it's being collected by a wearable device, if it's being collected on an ePro, then you're going to want to employ more decentralized approach to monitoring that data, or a centralized, I should say, centralized monitoring approach to looking at that data. Looking at it centrally, more real time if possible, and really looking at those trends and across the board. And then lastly, you want to consider how your study is being outsourced. I know that there's a large trend lately that we've noted where sponsors are wanting to really parse out the different work that they're doing. So they might have one organization running the project management and clinical aspect of the study, but they have a different organization doing data management, and yet a third organization doing the biometrics piece and writing the report at the end of the study. And while that might help them in some ways for budgetary reasons and to reduce the risk of having all of their eggs in one basket, it can cause some issues when it comes to this data flow, because you might have your company running the project management clinical aspect, doing the RPQM portion and doing the monitoring of the data. So there has to be a clean way for the data to flow or to get to them to be able to monitor it. And then likewise, at the end of the day, for that final reconciliation, as you're pulling the data and you're cleaning the data and you're getting it ready for the report, there can be data flow issues there. So, if you have a trusted partner where you can keep a lot of those services in one place, sometimes that's the better option. Again, it depends on how you're building your program and how you're building your study. It may be better for you to keep those in separate places, but these are certainly things that you want to consider and plot out the risk for doing it in that way and try and mitigate those risks up front as much as possible. So again, pulling it back to startup or startup considerations, site selection is key here. Your sites are your data stewards. So you want to have high quality, good data stewards for your data, because at the end of the day, the data is your product and the data is what you need. So it's really important when you're considering sites to run a trial, and particularly a decentralized clinical trial, that they are well resourced, that they have plans for data entry and that they have thought about that data flow themselves. There are a lot of sites now that have not only their own EMR, but they have their own central e-source systems that's specific for clinical research. They have their ISF done electronically. They've embraced technology, and then others have not. So you want to really assess what kind of site you need for your study. You may not need a site like that. You may be able to do your trial with a traditional site because you're using such good vendors that they're able to mitigate those risks that come along with using a site that either hasn't done clinical research before or is very old brick and mortar old school. Or you may be looking to rely on a site that knows how to run a decentralized clinical trial and has a lot of these tools on hand. So you want to plan for that and think about that up front as you're building your study. So you have in mind what kind of sites that you're going to be looking for and going to be relying on for the success of your study. A lot of sites now do have plans for internal data cleaning. They run their own internal QCs. A lot of times they have their own staff that all the staff does is internal QC. So again, that is something that you may want to assess and look for when you're looking to select your sites and have an idea of what they have available. And I mentioned this before, and I'll mention it again, a comfort with technology. Your sites, again, they're your data stewards. They're going to be supporting your patients. So if they are not comfortable with the technology, they may not be able to help and provide support to patients who are going to be perhaps struggling with technology, if that is the route that you're going to be going. You want your site to be able to provide that patient support. Generally, if a patient's struggling with someone, the first phone call that they're going to make is probably going to be to their site. So you want to know that your site is going to be well resourced enough to be able to answer that call, and will have the familiarity and the comfort with the technology to be able to help troubleshoot whatever issue that patient may be having over the phone. And then, of course, that you want to work with vendors that also have that support system in mind as well. So that's another important thing to talk about to your vendors. I know that's not directly related to the site, but your vendors have adequate support to help support the technology that you might be using. Not only provide support to you, but potentially provide support to sites who might need that extra tier. And then additionally, think and plan ahead for what is needed to help provide that support in terms of guides and resources that you can make available for your patients. Patient education material is always appreciated and welcome and helpful, whether it's about the disease state or the study that they're doing or clinical trials in general, as well as guides and resources and things available to help them use the technology that they may be using, and maybe even put that into context. Why are they using it? Why are we doing it this way? What is the importance, and how does it tie into the success of your program? And then keeping in mind, developing these materials, great to have these materials available for patients. I always advocate to have informed consent guides that go along with the informed consent that they're signing, those types of things. But knowing that they are going to have to go through ethics and regulatory, sometimes approvals before going into the hands of the patient. So not doing those, not putting together those materials as an afterthought, as sometimes will occur, but really planning for it and having those materials available and translated and available prior to the launch of your study and prior to the activation of your first site, so that those resources are available for sites and available for patients as soon as your first patient comes in the door and has those adequate approvals. So that's all I had to say about data integrity. So moving on, to our summary again, I think a key here has been early planning, quality by design, thoughtful design of your protocol up front, early selection of your partners and vendors. A lot of times people will say early selection of your sites, but I think that early selection of your partners and vendors prior to the selection of the sites is really key to driving startup in this DCT environment. Again, that alignment of the timelines is very important if you want to keep to those activation timelines. And close collaboration with your key partners and vendors. Find partners and vendors that you can really trust and collaborate with, and have them inform on your protocol, have them inform on your design, because there may be challenges or risks or things that you may not have thought of that they have seen before, and they can help you to mitigate those. And then again, that final concise plan for startup and activation and how you're going to pull all of those components together for your program will be key. If you have a plan, you can look to the plan and follow the plan and hopefully drive startup without experiencing some of the delays that can sometimes happen, particularly when you have so many different partners and vendors in the mix. So now we will open for questions. Laura Beth, I'm passing it back over to you.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you both for that presentation. We just want to thank you for that. And we have had some questions come in during our presentation. So I'd like to remind participants to continue to use the Q&A widget. And if we don't address your question directly during the webinar, one of our presenters will follow up with you via email after the webinar is closed. But you can use that Q&A widget here for the remainder of our time. And so I want to jump into our questions today. And the first question here is, will DCT continue once the pandemic is over?
I'll take that question. I definitely think that it will. We were certainly moving in that direction before the COVID pandemic started. I think COVID accelerated things quite a bit. We really had to pivot to moving towards some of those solutions. But I think that now that things are moving and moving in that direction, and we're seeing some success, we're seeing some challenges, but we're seeing some successes as well. I think that it will continue to move in this direction. I think the most common approach will probably be a hybrid DCT approach as opposed to doing a truly siteless study.
Excellent. Thank you for jumping on that question. Okay. And next question here, does a DCT approach make startup timelines longer?
I'll answer that one as well. They can, I think, is the answer to that. I think they can. Again, I think planning really early on, knowing what vendors you're going to use and what timelines you're looking at, and really planning realistically and appropriately, I think can help mitigate that. But yeah, it can. As Mark mentioned, if you're dealing with different aspects of activation that are needed through different vendors and you're relying on more partners, certainly delays can occur. But I don't think that they have to. I think with proactive planning, I think that you can have successful startup and quick startup just as you would for a traditional study.
Okay, excellent answer there. Okay. Next question here. You mentioned that technology could extend a site's footprint into rural areas with populations that may otherwise not participate in clinical trials. But don't these same areas have limited access to high-speed internet, which would be needed to transmit data? Who'd like to take on that one?
I can grab that one. I think that's true in some ways that, remote areas maybe don't have the best internet service. They may not have, the newest 5G service, but I, really think that most areas with populations, still have internet service that's going to be acceptable to most of these vendors. And then plenty of vendors also still have additional solutions, as far as like storing and transmitting data, once someone's in an area. But for the most part, anywhere with population centers has the communication solutions to send stuff in. But anything's going to have, a little bit of drawbacks. And, you're not going to be able to capture, 100% of America with any plan. So there may be, some few corners that just haven't, been in this footprint yet.
Excellent. Thanks for taking that one on there, Mark. Okay. Next question here. You sort of indicated that an investigator may not be able to fully assess a patient's understanding of the ICF through telehealth. So how does telehealth diminish the investigator's ability to perform the consenting process remotely?
I can grab that. So, I think with anything in life, there's going to be some give and take, and there's going to be some drawbacks and positives to anything. But, with telehealth, you may have a patient that you're consenting or that investigator is consenting, and that patient may be fidgeting with their hands, or they may have like restless legs, and this may be out of the view of the camera. So if that consent was in person, I would think the responsible investigator, or if the investigator determined that a patient was very nervous, these are some signs of nervousness, they may, take a step back. They may, take that time to make sure that they're providing additional information, that they're being very clear, and that they're making sure that the patient gets any more questions answered that they may be holding back. And then, they probably request that they take the consent home for review. And so signs like that, may change how the consenting process happens on site, via telehealth, may be missed in some instances.
Okay, great answer there. Thank you. Okay. Another question here. Okay, if we were to have a diabetes trial that required wearable health monitors, I know my grandparents would be uncomfortable participating in such trials. How then does the use of these devices increase patient participation?
I think that kind of goes back to, what I was saying, previously, that there's going to be give and take with everything. So, I think during trial design and vendor selection, your patient population really needs to be well understood and considered. I mentioned earlier, about reaching out to advocacy groups and, having those detailed discussion with investigators or even other providers that see this population to make sure that you really understand them and you understand, what's going to be needs for them. So whereas not ever having to come into having these wearable devices, which prevents a patient from coming into offices, really may encourage some to join a trial because it lowers that patient burden. But in other cases, it really may discourage them because they have to wear a device. Maybe they don't like the feeling of being tracked, or maybe they're just, technology doesn't really suit them. So in the end, this goes back to really, having that conversations up front at the beginning of the trial and making sure that during trial design that you select the option that you feel is going to best support your trial. And so in some cases, there'll be give and take, but if you really kind of understand your patient population, you should hopefully be able to make a decision that is going to, give more than take.
And I want to jump in and add to that answer, Mark. Again, this is where selecting a vendor earlier on and collaborating with that vendor can really be helpful, because you might be working with a vendor that is providing these wearables, for example, that has worked with similar populations before. So they can give you a lot of advice in terms of issues that they've seen, and that can be helpful as well.
Great points from both of you there. Thank you. Okay. Next question here. Have you seen any types of challenges, pushbacks with IRBs and their review approvals with DCTs as compared to traditional studies? If so, what are some of the most common or main challenges?
So that is a great question. And that is a big question that I had when we started moving into that space and exploring this area. My answer is, so far in the U.S., we have not actually experienced, surprisingly, a lot of challenges and pushbacks. I would say where most of it does occur, when it does occur, is in certain sections of the informed consent, particularly as it pertains to privacy of data. That seems to be the one area of the consent where the IRB perhaps has some pushback or asks for you to make some changes. Particularly ethics committees in Europe are a little bit more conservative. So in the US, surprisingly, have not seen a lot of pushback. But I think with larger academic institutions, that's where it has occurred in the US, and then in Europe, you see that occur a little bit more than you do here. There's certainly some more considerations when you're doing studies where it comes to data capture in the EU. So it's a very good question, and was definitely one that I had as we were jumping into the space.
Thank you for taking that one on there. Okay. Another question I want to slip in here. What is the biggest obstacle to activating sites on a DCT study?
I can take that one too, Mark, unless you have spots. I would say the biggest challenge that we've experienced firsthand has just been all of the different steps that you have to add in to take to activate the sites. Whether it's different accesses or approvals or provisioning of devices and things that can get hung up in different, places, particularly if you have tweaks or changes to the protocol that somehow impact the deployment of those activities. I think that is the biggest challenge really to activation and tracking all of those steps along the way. It's not the traditional, okay, we get a reg packet in, we get our IRB approval, we have a final contract, we're good to go. Now there are all of these additional steps that you have to, or boxes that you have to check before you get there. So a good activation plan and a really great method of tracking those steps along the way has been important in overcoming those obstacles. I don't know if you had anything to add, Mark.
Yeah, I think that really hits in it. Sort of what I was saying earlier is about understanding, exactly what each vendor needs going in there and making sure that the site is aware of that, at site selection so they can start preparing for that. So really having, not only a plan, but, detailed instructions, first detailed understanding of what the vendors need, how you're going to track it, like Marina said, and how it's going to be handled from the CRO side to the sponsor to the vendor, and then making sure that, you provide the sites with the details and the instructions and what to provide and when from the get-go. Because like I said, you come back 2 weeks later after they've been selected and you're like, well, I actually need this additional bit of information or this, and that can sometimes slow things down. So again, it's just putting that planning in on the front end will really help.
Well, thank you both for taking all of those questions. That's all the time we have today for questions. We would like to thank everyone for joining us. If we were not able to answer your question, please know that we do capture all submitted comments, and someone from the team will follow up in the coming days. As a reminder, the recording of today's webinar will be available via the same link you accessed for today's live presentation. Thanks again to our presenters and, of course, to you, our audience, for joining us. Have a great day, everyone.